Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight, and I'm very pleased to be joined by journalist and evolutionary biologist Colin Wright. Colin, nice to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's really good to be on your podcast finally. I'm a fan.
Oh, thank you, man. It's my pleasure. I was just saying to you before we started recording that I've been keeping a keen eye on your content and your Twitter feed, and you laser focus on the science in this this argument over gender at the moment, so I'm really looking forward to delving into that. Before we do, maybe you can just give us an outline of what it is you do. How would you describe how you spend your time?
So currently I'm managing my own Substack called Reality's Last Stand, and it's really just dedicated to tackling the issue of sex denialism and gender ideology from as many angles as possible. I started out writing a bunch of stuff like why sex is in the spectrum, why there's only two sexes, things like that, just because I would constantly get bombarded by people asking me to explain these things, so I figured maybe I can just send them a link. And now I feel a lot of other stuff. I have people that sort of tackle the gender ideology as a whole, people who publish articles on my Substack on, the problems with gender medicine and some of that type of stuff. So that's what I currently do. But I used to be an academic scientist. I worked at Penn State. I studied social behavior in insects and arachnids. And it was actually me commenting on a lot of these issues on sex and gender that I saw sort of cropping up around me with my colleagues saying things like there's 5 sexes, or sex is a spectrum, or it's a social construct. That made me write some articles early on for Quillette that really made my colleagues extremely angry, and I think pretty much destroyed my chances of getting a tenure track professorship in the field. So I left there. I worked for Quillette for about a couple of years after that, and then just started doing my Substack, which is sort of, I guess my goal with it is, one, to bring out this information that I think people and society needs, and also to become as uncancelable as possible. That's sort of my motivation.
That's the thing, isn't it? Because it seems like this entire topic is one giant landmine when it comes to people's livelihoods and careers. So maybe we'll circle back around to why we're in this situation a bit later. But I suppose what I want to start with is because people seem to be very confused about biology at the moment. It seems like everyone's having to go back to school, really, to deal with the current climate and culture and legislation and trends. So I suppose the easy one to start with is, how are we defining male and female? What scientific objective characteristics can we point to distinguish between a man and a woman? And I can't believe I'm having to ask that question in 2022.
Yeah, it is bizarre that this is something we have to go back to the Bio 101 textbooks. So, I mean, in essence, when we're talking about what makes a male and a female, this sort of goes back to, well, if we take one step back and look at sort of the concept of what a male and female is, it comes back to what type of gamete or sex cell that a male or female produces. So males are defined as the organisms that are producing small gametes, so sperm, and then females are defined as the organisms that in a sexually reproducing population are producing the large gametes, eggs. So males and females are entirely defined on the size of the gametes they produce relative to one another. Now, a lot of activists will then say, like, well, some people don't produce sperm or eggs. Are they just sexless or something? So when we actually go down to sexing a flesh and blood individual, it's not whether they can at any given moment produce eggs or sperm, but if they have sort of, the reproductive anatomy is organized around the production of that. Maybe they got injured and they can't do it, maybe for whatever reason they're sterile, but it's basically just sort of like an organizational plan for the production of eggs and sperm. So you can usually kind of come down to whether or not you have testes or ovaries, for instance. This is largely how it's defined. So yeah, that's sort of the Bio 101. It's the organizational, how your reproductive anatomy is organized around for the production of either sperm or ova.
So you obviously are in the camp that sex is binary. So I like to refer to that as the camp of reality, obviously. But people will often obviously throw in the idea of intersex people and how that contradicts the idea of sex as a binary. I mean, how does that fit in to your reasoning, and how prevalent are people who are intersex, or difference in sex characteristics, I think it's sometimes referred to as?
Yeah, people will throw in intersex people as sort of an example of individuals who sort of bridge this gap between males and females, and therefore, because they exist, sex is a spectrum. Males and females should therefore be thought about as sort of these degrees of maleness and femaleness, because if there's something sort of intermediate, then that means there's a gradient. I think what a lot of confusion comes from is they're misinterpreting a statement like sex is binary for the statement every single individual who has ever existed and will ever exist can unambiguously be classified as either male or female. So that's not really what I mean by this. I think it's maybe theoretically possible that there could be an individual who's born who just really has these developmental conditions that have resulted in like a truly ambiguous sexual phenotype where we're like, this is really difficult to classify this individual one or the other. That doesn't really undermine the sex binary, because when I say sex is binary, what I mean is there are only two sexes. An intersex individual isn't a third sex in the same way that a male or a female is, because again, males and females are defined sort of by the type of gamete that their reproductive systems are organized around to produce. We could take a different species that maybe has hermaphrodites, like some snails, where individuals, or some frogs too, individuals truly do produce and have the reproductive anatomy for both producing eggs or sperm. They're still not an example of a third sex. They're an example of an individual who's both male and female. They're composed of both sexes in one individual. So that's really just what I mean when I say sex is binary. There's only two. There's two components to biological sex. Whether an individual can be sort of undefined and sexless, I don't think there's a really clear example of that happening, but I think it might theoretically be possible. And then any sort of indication that some individuals might be able to produce both. Again, there's no real clear examples in the literature of individuals who've been able to produce both a sperm or ova, or have had the reproductive organizational plan and set in place to do that. But even if an example could be brought up of this person producing both eggs and sperm, they still wouldn't be a third sex. There's an example of someone who's exhibiting both sexes in one person. So that's what we mean by sex is binary. There's only two. Intersex is sort of this umbrella term we use for sort of general sex ambiguity at first glance. The doctor looks at, they say, ambiguous genitalia. They're considered to have an intersex condition. It's not meant to be considered a third sex in any meaningful way.
Yeah, and I think it's a shame, really, because we often see this thrown around in the service of trans ideology, and a lot of intersex people are kind of the opinion of just keep me out of this. I'm nothing to do with this. It's obviously often exploited as some sort of gambit in this row. But I often see think pieces thrown around of people claiming that intersex people are just as common as, say, meeting people with red hair and things like that. But I believe you've done a fair bit of work debunking those statistics, haven't you?
Yeah, that claim specifically that intersex is around 1.7 or 2%, just as common as red hair. This is based on basically Anne Fausto Sterling. She had this article with someone, their last name is Blacklist, and they basically, their definition was literally defining male and female based on, they even said like Platonic ideals of male and female. They had like a range of how long the penis can be, how long the clitoris can be before they have intersex conditions. But what that does is you can have a male with a micropenis who's still 100% male. They just have a tiny penis, and by their definition, this would be an intersex condition, and someone who's like maybe not entirely male. So that's not the case. I mean, I feel bad for people who have this condition, but they're still 100% male. Your penis length doesn't define how male you are in any meaningful way. So when we actually go to like a clinical, and also the definition also includes people like who have Klinefelter syndrome, who they're like XXY chromosomes. Now these people might have some like breast development that takes place, but they're still 100% male. They still have testes and a penis, and they can father children, and they're fertile as males. They might exhibit some secondary sex characteristics like breast development that are more typical for females, but still 100% male. So it's really lacking a clinical relevance when you just expand the definition of what intersex is to like any variation of sexual development that deviates from the Platonic ideal. Like, that is such a broad category. And it includes individuals who are just unambiguously male or female now. When you actually use a definition that is more like, the appearance of sexual ambiguity, the prevalence is about 0.018%, about 1 in 5,000, that are people who have like a true intersex condition. So that's something I try to debunk, because they try to inflate the numbers of intersex to make it seem like the boundaries between males and females are much more blurry than it really is. Yeah,
and it's especially useless as an example, given it does not map on to transgenderism anyway.
Exactly.
Overwhelmingly.
That's just such a good point, too, is they'll say that, why can't transgender women play in female sports? We'll say, well, because they're biologically male. They'll say, well, but sex is a spectrum, intersex people exist. It's like, okay, well, they're not intersex. These are just unambiguous males who are trying to compete in females. So, like, their arguments aren't even for the purpose of, they don't even get them where they hope they go. So it's really frustrating having to deal with these.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm interested in sort of finding out why you decided to dip your toe into this arena, whether or not there was some sort of flashpoint, because, I mean, a lot of people who may agree with you on the biology aspect of it will say, well, why does it really matter? How does it have any effect on your life? If people want to live and operate as the opposite sex, big deal. Why throw a spanner in the works with your output?
Yeah, I get that a lot, and I got that even much more early on when I decided to start writing about this. I don't know what gave me sort of the impetus to want to just sort of plant my flag on this hill. I had been like in the atheist community before. I had been really big on like debunking things. I used to have a blog before during those years where I debunked a lot of creationist claims about evolution, about sort of folk medicine type stuff, ancient Chinese medicine. I would like to debunk these things. This is what I did. I cared about what's true over anything else. And when I was criticizing creationism and intelligent design, all my colleagues and stuff when I was undergrad at this time, it was fully supportive of just demolishing these arguments. And then when I saw people from within the university making these crazy claims, like there's 5 sexes, or sex is a spectrum, or a social construct, it's not even, we just have these clouds of maleness and femaleness, it's a statistical thing, it's not a category. I initially thought I could just present them with the updated evidence of like, oh, these people are just confused about what sex is. Here's what sex actually is. You're just, confused, but do it in a really kind way. And I was expecting to receive back sort of their evidence and we could have a nice back and forth. But instead, I just was called all sorts of names. They called me a transphobe. I'm just, alt-right talking points, all this stuff. And this was wildly different than anything I had seen when I had criticized, the intelligent design people, who they're usually willing to argue with you, at least, and provide their evidence as poor as I think it is. They think that there's some truth there to get at. So I saw that as a problem because, I had gotten into science because I care about what's true, and I thought that being a professor and an academic was the best place to pursue truth and to talk with the experts in the world about what's true and sort of use evidence and reason to come to conclusions. And I guess once I realized that wasn't the case, at least in this area, it's not really something I wanted to do anymore. All the best conversations were taking place outside of academia on this. And I was just trying to write some articles on this, and my career was being attacked from all sides from within the university. So I didn't want to just slink away and stop tweeting about this and writing articles. That would just violate every principle that I had of caring about what's true and why it matters. And biological sex happens to be just a fundamental truth about human nature that if you deny that its existence and its reality, crazy things will happen. We have males competing in female sports. We have kids who are saying that they're identify as the opposite sex, and now we're trying to give them gender-affirming surgeries to change their secondary sex characteristics. And there's just so many things that spring forth from denying of such a fundamental aspect of biology, and that's why I defended evolution before, because it was such a fundamental aspect of biology in general. So, I just couldn't help but keep pushing on this because it's such an important thing. I think it's a fundamental truth.
Has academia been completely captured by gender ideology at this point, in your view?
Depends on the field. I never thought it could really take over my field of evolution and ecology. They've always seemed to be some of the more rational groups of people when it comes to sort of this type of ideological, being impervious to ideology sweeping through. But I really do. I mean, I don't know any of my colleagues, and I collaborated with a lot of people. I can name one. I can name one person who has my back in there, but they won't say a word. All the other people, they've either publicly denounced me or they've told me so privately. They want nothing to do with me. They think I'm just this crazy person who's a conspiracy theorist or what have you. So I think it's mostly captured. The physics and mathematics, I don't think they're that captured, although there are some crazy stuff about math equity and just applying sort of a critical race theory lens or some postmodern concepts to math and how it doesn't.
Yeah, math as a colonial construct.
Yeah, all that stuff. Yeah. Decolonized math, all this stuff. So it's happening, but I just think the guardrails are a little higher just because the entry into these fields is so much more difficult. It just takes a sort of a special type of mind to get in there. But who knows? I mean, I never thought it could happen with evolutionary biology, and here we are.
Yeah, I can really relate to what you were saying a little while ago about wanting to debunk and how you were sort of interested in debunking creationist claims, and I suppose you gravitated in new atheist circles. And that's always been something I've been interested in because that seemed like the great place to be if you wanted to lead by scientific inquiry and if you wanted to defend an enlightenment principle such as free speech. Those things are massively important to me, and sort of atheist circles seem to be the best gig in town in terms of having good discussions involving those things. And I think it's had, to my mind, or personally, and it goes back to this idea of being called a bigot for just kind of pivoting in a different direction. It's had two massive tests very recently, and I think the first one was probably the expansion of Islamic terrorism in the West. I think people have had to put down the kid gloves, and it was all fun and games mocking Christians and conservatives in America. But then when you've got to shift your angle to people who sometimes, most often in fact, are non-white, and you've been told to protect these people as a minority, and you somehow want to treat them differently for Christians, it kind of, the hypocrisy is on show. But also this idea of gender ideology. Gender ideology has been a massive test for these groups, and I don't think with reference to the American groups especially, have fared particularly well in terms of upholding scientific reason and freedom of expression. I think that was possibly exemplified by how the American Atheist Organization and the Humanist Organization in the States have pretty much excommunicated Richard Dawkins for asking questions on this topic. So as somebody who started out in them circles, is probably on the outside now, what are your thoughts looking at these institutions and organisations now that you would hope would be best placed to resist this sort of pseudo-scientific cult thinking?
Yeah, I mean, you hit it on the head. Atheism was sort of this bastion of reason and free thought. That's what really made me gravitate to it. I was early on the richarddawkins.net forums. That was just, there was nothing like it at the time where you could just sort of have this really great just intellectual discussion on literally any topic you wanted to, not just atheism. Then, slowly atheism got taken over by there was like a woke fringe. And I remember being sort of, I guess what I would say is like the proto-woke ideology there was what had to do with Islam, as you mentioned, where people weren't even like criticizing Sam Harris for what he said about Islam necessarily, but it was more of the lines of, you can't say that because even though it's true, far-right people who have much of a less nuanced point will use your arguments to further their extreme agenda. So therefore, Sam Harris, you better shut up and not say true things, because, we can't expect everyone to be so nuanced as you. And I see the same exact thing with the whole gender stuff. Like, I'm still waiting for the takedown of my arguments about biology and my criticisms of gender ideology, but all I get is people coming at me saying, I'm just making these talking points that's going to be used as fuel for the far right because they really do hate transgender people as transgender people. And some of them do, and that's unfortunate, and I don't want to embolden them. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we should take an extreme position on the other way, and we can't even clarify scientific facts about what sex is and things like that. Like, you need to have the nuanced discussion about the middle, because I'm no friend of the far right. I'm not coming at this as a political lens whatsoever. I'm just making true statements about biology and seeing the spin-offs of what happens when people are denying this. So, yeah, I'm sure there's people who were using my Substack articles to fuel their hatred, sure, but that doesn't mean what I'm writing is wrong or is self-hatred. It's just, you can't put me in that camp with those other people. It's, the science there's no moral valence to it. It's just, it is what it is, and do with it as you please.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a stupid argument that you're emboldening the far right, because, on that premise, they're asking you to completely disengage. So by that method, you are just handing the entire arena to the far right on this topic, which is surely not what we want to do. We want sensible, skeptical, compassionate voices talking about it. And keeping on this idea of compassion, one of the things everyone seems to get told time and time again is this idea of, if you publicly speak out against these things, you're already kind of throwing fuel on a particularly precarious situation, which is trans mental health and how that's linked to suicide. And apparently, if we talk about this honestly and people disagree with gender ideology, we're only fast-tracking transgender people to suicidal thoughts or actions. How do you respond to that sort of thing when it comes your way?
The data on suicide rates, it's just really astonishing, the types of papers that are getting published and held up as these definitive examples of why we should have these policies to just affirm children in their trans identities. One thing that really stands out to me in this whole thing, well, for one, like, the studies there are flawed. They're comparing people who are identifying as trans who have a whole lot of mental health issues. They're comparing them to kids who don't have any mental health issues, rather than kids who have a similar amount of mental health issues, not including gender dysphoria. And when you actually look at the proper control there, the suicide rates are very much the same. And plus, they don't really go down after they are giving gender affirming care. So there's that. And then I was recently just looking up how transgenderism is defined in some of our major institutions, such as Planned Parenthood and the Human Rights Campaign, and then scientific organizations, medical organizations, American Psychiatric Association, the Endocrine Society, pretty much all the major ones. And they literally define transgenderism as people whose gender identity or gender expression does not conform to what society expects based on the sex they were assigned at birth. So this is just complete gender. They're making the claim that gender nonconformity is synonymous with being transgender. And I have a piece that's coming out on this pretty soon that just exposes all these definitions. And it's not like I'm reading between the lines. They're literally just equating being transgender with being gender nonconforming, and not being masculine if you're a male, or not being feminine if you're a girl. That's really dangerous, because this is associated with things like being put on puberty blockers. It's a medicalized concept. And then where we have this notion that your brain can actually not match your body, that if you're gender nonconforming, you're somehow at odds with yourself. There's a mismatch that needs to be corrected, and that can be corrected by transitioning your body through hormones and surgeries, rather than saying boys and girls can be both masculine and feminine. There's a wide range of behaviors among both boys and girls, and we should let people just be who they are. Not to say that the moment the boy starts playing with dolls, maybe they're actually a girl trapped in a boy's body. This is literally where we are right now, and it's frightening seeing things like the Boston Children's Hospital talking about phalloplasties and vaginoplasties for children with, upbeat music and smiles while they're doing it. I think it's just a medical scandal at just a truly epic proportion, and it's really wild. It's like observing it happening in real time.
I was interviewing Julie Bindel, a very prominent feminist in the UK, the other day, and she actually likened this in terms of the scandal proportion to thalidomide, which is, I think, is a very interesting point to make. And just circling back to this idea of puberty blockers, the gender activists will tell us this is pretty much consequence-free. If it doesn't work out, we can just, there's no lasting damage. So what data do we have on these things now? Because they'll also point to the fact that we don't really tend to have much long-term data on this anyway. So do we know of any lasting damage from puberty blockers that's been objectively established?
They really don't have long-term studies on puberty blockers. You'll hear these sweeping claims being made that, they're completely safe, they're completely reversible. There's just a pause button and you can go off it. I think in Matt Walsh's video, one of them said it's just like pausing a song, and you can just, pause the song and then push play again, and just the next note will pick up right where it left off. All these claims really are being made with reference to their on-label use, which is to treat what's called precocious puberty, which is when young girls, 5, 6, 7 years old, begin puberty at such a young age. And this can have really bad consequences on your body when you have, surging estrogen. They can cause skeletal abnormalities as you're growing, because you're going through puberty with a skeleton that's not really ready to take on these bodily changes. So usually they'll be given puberty blockers at a very young age, and then they're taken off puberty blockers when they would normally be entering in the time where their bodies are prepared for puberty. And in these cases, there still are some side effects. Some kids still have bone issues from blocking their puberty, and but it's better than what happens if you go through puberty at such a young age. So there's a trade-off. It seems to be worth it in the case of precocious puberty. They're now being used off-label to treat gender dysphoria, where they're used to block kids' normal pubertal window when they're 11, 12, 13. And we just have no idea what happens when you're blocking normal puberty. There's some suggestions that you don't have your genitals don't mature. And it's not just the secondary sex characteristics. It's not just halting breast development and facial hair growth and voice changes. It changes, it blocks the hormones' effect on your mind, too. So there's been some studies that have linked it to lower IQ. I think there's now these labels, there's a warning been issued recently by the FDA that it could cause brain swelling and blindness in some people. So this is all to say that this is still very much experimental, and we shouldn't be using this on children until I don't think we should be using it at all on children, because we don't really know what they do. But what we do know, because these are commonly billed as being, when kids are trying to explore their gender identity, they need to buy more time. We'll put them on puberty blockers. This will just let them have, some time to think about their true gender identity before their bodies are developing. But the data we currently have shows that almost 100% of kids who are put on puberty blockers go on to cross-sex hormones, and some of them pursue surgeries and things like that. And when you combine puberty blockers with cross-sex hormones, that sterilizes you forever. You will never be able to have children. And so far from just being this pause button and letting kids buy time to explore their gender, what it really does is solidify their dysphoria. It makes them almost guaranteed to not desist from their current state of dysphoria. Every study that's currently done has shown this. 97%, some studies 100% of the kids who go on this. So it's just wild. I mean, this isn't seen. I mean, there was a video that Chris Rufo posted on Twitter about, I think it was the Pittsburgh Children's Hospital, saying, or if you're just questioning your gender, you can be put on puberty blockers. How many parents would say okay to this if they actually knew that their child is almost guaranteed to go on to cross-sex hormones and surgeries if they're put on puberty blockers? Probably not many.
Yeah. It's an awful experiment to be playing out with children, for sure. Now, I mean, the situation's, I'd say, slightly different in the UK now. It feels like we are making progress on this score. One of the largest clinics, one of the main offenders on this, the Tavistock, has been closed down. It's been found not fit for purpose. And although the governments and the health organisations are actually opening more gender clinics in the UK now, they're going to be laser focused on a more holistic approach, which I think means more about counselling and things like that before any sort of medication or surgeries recommended. Is there anything going on in the States right now that gives you cause for hope? It feels like the tide's changing in the UK a little bit. How does it feel from across the pond?
Feels pretty dire. I'm not going to lie. I think,
Right.
There is some cultural progress that's being made. I think there's a lot more outrage, and every day it sort of gets more and more intense. So I think there is a resistance that's building. But in terms of actual laws being made and what's happening, every once in a while we'll get some sports organization that'll ban trans or male athletes from female sports, or they'll try to have a certain bathroom bills in some red states that do some good stuff, but nothing really at a federal level whatsoever that's being done on this. And there doesn't seem to be any breaks currently at the moment. I mean, the Biden administration has been just embracing this gender affirmation approach. Rachel Levine, who's the head of one of the health departments, is just going on TV and saying that this is one of the most important and compassionate things you can do for your kid, is to affirm their trans identities. So I think we have a lot of ways to go. We're not quite as bad as Canada, I would say, where there's not even a healthy resistance building. Both their parties almost vote unanimously for the gender affirmation thing as across the board. I think they're as close to a lost cause as possible. But hopefully we can see the UK. Maybe that'll create a domino effect in at least the red states, and maybe that'll affect blue states, and then maybe Canada will get with the picture. Probably very last, though. Yeah,
there's this misconception that a lot of the pushback to this problem is coming solely from men, predominantly right-wing men, and that's just not what I see in the UK. It's loads of grassroots feminist groups, middle-aged women mostly who have concerns about their daughters and their spaces and prisons. And one of the things that is slightly different hugely different in the States versus the UK is your beautiful First Amendment, which I am so envious of, this protection of speech. And the UK, we have various hate speech laws, and I'm no doubt you would have seen various instances of women having visits from the police for tweeting the wrong thing or writing the wrong thing. Or we had one today that was posted on Twitter. A woman had a sticker in her window that read, "Trans ideology erases women," and police community support officers came to her door to tell her it was offensive, to ask her to remove it, and give her a mini lecture on why she's wrong about gender ideology and how trans women are women and how she needs to educate herself. And this distressed this woman quite a bit, this woman who's also suffered a rape in her life as well. So what do you think when you look at the UK and see the ridiculous problems we have with speech around this issue? It's pretty horrific. Yeah, I'm so thankful for the First Amendment that we have. There's all these debates about, how much it might be under threat with some people who do propose that there should be, a little carve out for hate speech, which I'm very much against that carve out. But yeah, when you have countries that don't have this, these protections for free speech, the police literally turn into the thought police in this case. No, a trans woman is a woman. Well, we might have different definitions of what it means to be a woman. And, just the idea that an officer could show up to check your thinking, and especially with the whole, what do they call, non-crime hate incidents in the UK? Yes, are that's a ridiculous scenario. Recorded? Because I'm sure there's a database somewhere. It's what do they do with these things? They say it's non-crime, so why are you being put on a list for non-crime? It's crazy, and a lot of special interest groups who thrive off victimhood use these stats to claim massive increases in hate crimes and use the hate incident database, and the hate incident database can be, I mean, anything that's complained about and described as a hate incident gets logged on there, and this can be a Facebook post, a funny look, anything really. And for a time, and I think there was a recent court case on this, but for a time it was something that could be seen by future employers as well. Future employers were making decisions about your suitability for a role based on whether or not you'd been classed in as committing a non-crime hate incident, which is it's so Orwellian, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's so bizarre that that's even a thing. It really just exposes, the reason why you need to have free speech protections, because, I mean, it comes down to, well, who gets to define what's hateful and what isn't? And, you might be all for having these hate speech laws when you're in power, but do you really trust those powers to define what's hateful if your opponent suddenly becomes the one in power? Like, it's a double-edged sword, so you don't want to give anyone that power. So rather than, especially the government, that power to define what's hateful and what's not, because, I mean, the people who are currently making these hate speech laws in the UK, I mean, it wouldn't be right to do it, but if they become the minority at some point, it's their ideology that could be on the chopping block for what's hateful, and they're going to be getting the police knocking on their doors. I don't think the police should be knocking on anyone's door for their thoughts. So this is why, you need to defend free speech for the people that you disagree with the most. That's the true test of whether you think, you're committed to this idea of free speech and exchange of ideas.
Absolutely. So if we circle back to this idea of biological sex, people will often muddy the water and say, okay, well, sex is binary and immutable, but gender's on a spectrum. Gender is something different, and that does a lot of heavy lifting for gender ideology. Is there a distinction to be made between gender and sex?
There can be. I mean, there are some definitions that some I think kind of make sense and some don't. There's so many different definitions of gender out there. I mean, there's like the radical feminist definition, which really talks about sort of these. I guess they would say gender is a social construct, but what they mean is that there are these social roles and expectations that are sort of put onto people who are males and females based on the sex that they appear to be. So we consider if you're a female, we sort of have this idea that you need to be, very feminine, very nurturing, very caring, submissive, all these things. And then there's sort of these stereotypes that we associate with being male. So I think that's an interesting concept of the sort of the binary notions of the social roles and expectations. That's kind of interesting. I hear people in the sciences, sometimes I studied animal behavior, and sometimes when they refer to gender differences, they're talking about just sort of the evolved or even socialized aspects of behavioral differences between male and female organisms. Sometimes it's used that way. But the way it's being used by a lot of the sort of gender activists is that it's sort of like this immaterial soul that they have. It's, they claim that it's not based on social roles or stereotypes, but it just is. If you even look at how the APA is defining these things in the Endocrine Society. In their view, the gender binary are those social roles and expectations. And so if you're trans, that means that, one, you're either a male who identifies with the opposite social role, or if you're non-binary, that means you don't identify with either of the social roles. So, I mean, again, this is just equating being trans or not trans with gender stereotypes, and whether or not you embrace or reject them. That wouldn't necessarily be an issue if it weren't being medicalized the way that it is. We can redefine terms. We can have certain social movements that are happening among youth. But this is sort of a top-down thing that it has a very strong medical component to it. That was what makes it so dangerous. So I think that definition of gender, it's harmful to embrace that notion that it's just based on stereotypes. Given what usually happens when gender nonconforming kids claim to, not embrace the stereotypes associated with their sex nowadays.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you see that the gender ideologues have claimed Joan of Arc in the UK new production, and it's a very strange message to be sending to young girls, isn't it, that if you have heroic and strong, stereotypically masculine traits, that kind of opts you out of womanhood and the female sex. Like you say, this entire ideology relies entirely on stereotypes. But I think we touched on it briefly before, and something that's become a very fertile battleground for this argument is women's sports, and it's been tragic in one sense, but quite helpful in another. Tragic in the sense that women are obviously missing out to the benefit of biological men, but positive in the sense that it's allowed the world to see the disparity here and how much difference biology does make in these circumstances. So maybe, I mean, two of the big sort of people representing this argument, I suppose, were Laurel Hubbard, the weightlifter, Leah Thomas, the swimmer, and I wonder what kind of things can you point to objectively that give biological men an edge in physical sports, because there are still people there that think it's entirely a product of culture and society, as if we just put more money into female sports, if they just had the level of training and attention the men did, they'd be able to compete at exactly the same level. So what differences are there that are significant?
Yeah, there are sort of two sources of the differences that makes males more athletic in general. You know, on average, this is not like every male is going to beat every female in a sprint or anything like that. So the first is, and this is something that's not really acknowledged as much, is that there are actually sex differences in athletic ability before puberty. And male boys, they tend to outperform girls in sports from the same age, you know, when they're under like 10, for instance, or something. Girls temporarily pass boys because they tend to go through puberty about 2 years earlier, so their bodies start developing. So there's a brief window from about maybe 11 to 13 where girls are actually, maybe like 10 to 12, when girls actually surpass boys in their athletic ability. But then as soon as boys enter puberty, 12 and 13, they just leave females in the dust, basically. And that gap never shrinks. It just, you know, goes to, think of, that's about 10% at the elite level of athletes. So the effects of, you know, male puberty is what is mainly contributing to these large disparities in the sex differences between males and females. You know, it makes men go on this huge growth spurt, gives them much more upper body strength. Their tendons grow larger. They have more lung capacity, for instance. Their grip strength is increased. You know, you go down the line, anything that would matter for sports is just increased in males. This is there's not like, there's no ambiguity in this. It's very clear. A lot of people, I think, they sort of get confused because they think about, you know, when they were in school, you know, maybe they're a woman that, you know, they did really well. They were a really athletic girl and they could beat, you know, maybe most of the boys in their class. And so when we think about just the average person, you know, there's not a huge difference. You know some girls who are really tall, taller than most boys, you know, some girls who are strong. But in sports, it really matters because even small differences in like an average strength or average height or average whatever it is, explosiveness, that could be very small in the average. But then if you look at the far tail end, the extremes of the distribution, when we're talking about like elite sports, for instance, these very small differences in the average can turn into really disproportionate representations at the extremes where, you know, you get almost zero female representation who are going to be in the top, you know, 0.1% of strength for athletes or the speed for athletes. And so this is why we justify having sports segregated by sex. If we didn't have sports segregated by sex, and if we did it, say, by like body weight or something, the only women that you would get competing at an elite level are women who weigh like under 80 pounds or something, just because there's more women who are extremely light than men who are extremely light, for instance. So I mean, we can have that conversation. It is really just sort of a philosophical question of whether we should care about women competing in sports. I think they should be able to compete in their own leagues and be, you know, against like athletes. Some people don't think they should. If they don't think they should just really own that. They shouldn't try to make it so that there's no real differences between males and females, because that's just clearly not true. And it's one of the most clear things that there is. It's just it's such an extreme example of reality denial is hard to fathom.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for the longest time, the main focus was on testosterone. The idea was if we could just control levels to a significant degree, this would even the playing field. But obviously, data has since shown that's not the case. So what is the function of testosterone in this argument?
Yeah, so there are two things that testosterone will do. There's the effects that it has during puberty in making you bigger, faster, stronger in almost every conceivable way. But then there's also, circulating levels of testosterone also matter for sort of maintaining this strength. But an important thing is, you have a male who's gone through male puberty. There are so many aspects that aren't reversible just by removing that testosterone. You can't just... It's not just the current levels of testosterone that make a grown male more athletic than an adult female. You have to account for the past testosterone that has guided their bodies through male puberty to make them taller and bigger and faster and all these different things. So if you take if you go off testosterone, you block testosterone, you take estrogen, it doesn't make you shorter. It has very little impact on your grip strength. I think the best studies now show after about 3 years, the only decrease in strength and lean muscle mass is only about 5%. And, from all things considered, strength differences tend to be about 30% on average between males and females. So you might close the gap a little bit, but there's just so many things, that still remain between these categories. These, men who've gone on, who've blocked testosterone and women. It's still quite the gap athletically between these groups.
How do you feel about the people that subscribe to these ideologies sort of weaponizing language in a sense? It seems like if they can just get us to use the right words, they can win without evidence and reason. I mean, recent examples of that is trying to erase the word woman anywhere you can, replacing it with menstruators or birthing people or womb havers. These terms in isolation would just sound misogynist to anyone else, but we're also seeing a big emphasis on this idea of sex assigned at birth as well. How do you feel about this idea that doctors are basically just taking a punt on the sex of a baby, and it's all about their subjective worldview when it comes to applying a sex to a newborn?
It's completely insane. I mean, so there's two ways they'll talk about it. They'll talk about assigned sex, and that's based on their false notion that sex is a social construct and that we're just looking at genitals, which is only one aspect of sex, and we can't really know for sure whether it's male or female. Based on that, it's just a guess type of thing. So we'll have the people who say that assigned sex is based on this notion that sexes are just sort of these statistical things, not a definitive category. But then you'll have people talk about assigned gender as well, and they'll use these interchangeably. Sometimes they'll say assigned sex, sometimes they'll say assigned gender. The assigned gender stuff is really, it's really a conspiracy theory. They literally think that when a doctor is, they hold up this infant that they've just delivered, and they see the presence of a penis. When they say that it's a boy, or when they put male on the birth certificate, they're assigning it a social role, an expectation. And so that's why they say that, let's let the child decide for itself what gender it is, rather than ascribing it to this binary of masculine and feminine. But no doctor is actually looking at a baby boy, looking at the baby's penis and saying, this is going to be a masculine, dominant individual who's, they're just literally just recording its biological sex. That's all they're doing. So, I mean, both those, assigned gender and assigned sex, they're both crazy. They're both used interchangeably. They won't acknowledge that they're doing that, but that's exactly what they're doing when they're actually pressed on, to explain themselves. If you go on Planned Parenthood website, they talk about the assigned sex and why they use it, and they say that it's making a decision for somebody else but some people feel differently. It's like, well, you can feel one way, but that doesn't mean you're not a male if you just don't feel like one. I don't even know what it means to feel like a male. It's just sort of a state that you have. Like, what does it feel like to have blue eyes? Like, I don't know. It's just a thing. It's just a fact about your body. The ideology is really, really crazy. And I think it just makes a lot of people hesitant to jump into it because they've colonized the language so much. It's almost impossible to write about. It's impossible to speak about. There's just landmines everywhere for anyone who just tries to dip a toe into it. and the social consequences for slipping up are really, really high for a lot of people. So it's a perfect storm to just get people to just back away and not even try to touch it.
So we've been speaking a lot about puberty blockers and medical treatment and childhood, and one of the things that is getting a lot more attention now, whereas it didn't before, is this idea of social contagion. There seems to be data to suggest that young girls specifically are announcing themselves as gender non-conforming or transgender in clusters, and it seems to be a thing that's reinforced amongst friends. The internet's been pointed at as one of the chief instigators of this, the idea of finding each other on forums and telling each other exactly what to say and think about it. And the issue we have as well a little bit is that sort of transgender rights and the emergence of transgender people is being compared to the same civil rights movement as gay people. And as we all know, as gay people were trying to emancipate themselves, that was often dismissed as a fad or a trend. And here we are now talking about young girls in pretty much the same sense about their confusion about their gender. So how much are you worried about this idea of social contagion? How much legitimacy does it have in your view?
I think it's pretty legitimate. I mean, you can just look at sort of the cluster outbreaks and see that it's occurring more in groups. I mean, that's good evidence that there's at least some social component to it. I mean, I just know by seeing on a lot of these Facebook groups about how, the parent will give one of their kids a book about girls transitioning to boys, and then a month later their daughter all of a sudden thinks she's a boy. So they're getting these ideas from their environment in a large part. So if social contagion does have a lot to do with the spread, but it's not merely just a social phenomenon that's going on. As I'll show in a piece coming up, that they're literally just going by the definitions of what it means to be trans by these big major human rights organizations and the scientific organizations who are just equating gender nonconformity with being transgender. I mean, this is why we don't call it transsexualism anymore. It's now has to do with gender, which has to do with social roles and stereotypes. So if gender nonconformity, if they go to the Endocrine Society and they're looking up, well, what does it mean to be transgender? It's having a identity or an expression or behaviors that aren't typically associated with your sex, then of course you're going to get this enormous influx of kids who are claiming to be transgender, because gender nonconformity is pretty common. Gender identity disorder is not, but if you equate the two, should surprise no one that you're going to see this huge influx of kids who think they're transgender. And we also know that girls tend to be, when they're growing up, to be more gender nonconforming than boys are. And so this is something else we're seeing with that sex ratio flip, that more girls tend to be coming out claiming to be transgender. So from my perspective, well, if you're going to change the definition of being transgender to be equating with gender nonconformity, and if girls tend to be more gender nonconforming than boys, yeah, you're going to see a huge spike in the number of kids who think they're trans, and it's going to favor girls heavily. Like, this is, there's just no surprise there for me. Like, this seems to be pretty straightforward, just based on, some pretty basic literature we know about humans and their behaviors.
Colin, thank you very much for speaking to me. I really enjoy your work, and I do think it's very important to lead on this discussion with the data and the science and bring it back to first principles. So is there anything you'd like to point my listeners and viewers to before I let you get back to your afternoon?
There's some really good organizations. There's one in the U.S., I think it's international. It's called SEGM, the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine. They're really great. There's a bunch of doctors and physicians who are in this field, and they do really good breakdowns of the evidence for a lot of the gender medicine going on there. Also, I don't want to self-promote too much, but my Substack, realitieslaststand.com, there's really great articles there, both written by me and other scientists who talk about biological sex and what it is and why it matters, why the sex spectrum is sort of, based on pseudoscience, etc. So go ahead and check that out too. And that's about it. Yeah, that's all I can think about.
Wonderful. I shall link to those things you just mentioned in the show notes so people can find them easily. But Colin, once again, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this. It's flown by.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it has gone by fast.